Chapter 9, we finally get to the fun part, or the funnerest part. All the stuff that we've been learning about our makeup. And these are your parts, and these are how they function. You got a soul, and the soul has 10 soul powers. And the soul can't do anything without a body. So the soul expresses itself to the world through a body, through thought, speech, and action. Your godly soul only wants to be part of the godness. It just wants to reunite with God. The animal soul just wants to live in this physical world. It just wants to take care of itself. What do they call these days? Self-care? That's the animal soul just wants to take care of itself. Whatever I feel like right now, that's what I want to do. They have competing interests. And now we've learned about that and we've learned about their makeup. What happens now that we put them both in the same body? Help! So chapter 9 starts off by telling us that. Where is the Nefesh Bahamas? Where does the animal soul dwell? It is in the left side of the heart. Why is it in the left side of the heart? Because that is the side that is full of blood. Obviously the whole heart has blood in it, but the right side pumps to the left side. So the right side, the right chamber is considered more of like a throughway to the left side. That's why the left side is considered blood, and blood, as we know, is passions and emotions. The animal soul is inside of the heart, and all it wants is the same way that blood spreads out to the rest of the body, even up to the brain. That's what the animal soul wants. Its emotions, its agenda, its MO to spread out from its place in the heart to the rest of the body. So whatever it's experiencing then, any sort of emotion, passion or lust or anger, any of these emotions that are more like raw material emotions. Lust is just a perversion of love. Think of it like that. All these emotions, there's a negative manifestation of them, and then there's more positive manifestations of them, all depending on how we use it and where it's coming from. The natural state that we're in, very counter to the world that we live in these days, to try to either have control over yourself or to not give into your natural state. Because like, well, this is me. How can you not let me express me? You have to let me be me. Yeah, but you is annoying. Really, our natural state, it's not, that's my real self. That's my true self. No, it's not your true self. Your natural state of being, reverting back to your natural state of being, are your raw materials to make your best self out of. And how do we make our best self is that through torments, godliness, etc. But saying, oh, but this is like my natural state of being, no. One example that we usually give in the other class, that we talk about someone who has a propensity to lose their temper. There are people who, they have bad tempers. Well, what do you want from me? I'm naturally inclined to be easily explosive. What do you want from me? I want from you to not lose your temper. So the animal soul is in the left side of the heart, this side that's full of blood. From there, it tries to spread out to the rest of the body. The Nefesh Elokis is in the brain. And from the brain, it tries to spread out for the rest of the body. Same way the brain talks to the whole body and feeds the whole body. The Nefesh Elokis, the godly soul, is in the brain and tries to spread out to the rest of the body. It is also in the right side of the heart. Godly soul is not without emotion. The difference is that it's the brain controls the emotions, the mind over matter, the mind over the heart, and not just free-for-all and everyone do their thing. Again, so we do have emotions that are connected to our Nefesh Elokis. For example, things like Avas Hashem, Yiras Hashem, things like that. Simcha is very important. These are things that we can ignite in our heart through using our mind. It's not just either relying on natural default emotion or a raw material emotion. Kind of what we were just saying, that our natural state of being are the raw materials we have to become a better self. So with the propensity for anger, that's a raw material. Not, oh, I'm an angry person, you have to let me give into my anger. No, your propensity toward anger is a raw material. And what you do with it is who your true self becomes. Now we go to where everything comes to head, where everything comes together. The Alter Rebbe now uses the pasuk, Ulum Milam Yamatz. This is the pasuk that was said to Rivkah. When Rivkah was pregnant with Yaakov and Esav, and every time she'd walk by a place of holiness, she'd feel the baby kick. She'd walk by a place of idolatry, she'd feel the baby wants to get out. So she's worrying about this two-headed, multiple personality baby that she might be having. What are you supposed to do? So she goes to the yeshiva Shem and Aver and tells her, Ulum Milam Yamatz. You've got two nations inside of you, and one nation will always prevail over the other. These two nations they're fighting for control. So Yaakov and Esav and their offspring, there's always a seesaw going on, of one nation rising and the other falling. There's almost never time of equilibrium between the two nations. And the Alter Rebbe says what's going on in our body is that our body, the guf is an ir katana, the cholivarv are the inhabitants. All of its limbs are the inhabitants of the city. And you have two kings of the two neshamas, and they're fighting over control of the city. They both want absolute control. There's no sharesies when it comes to being a monarch. There's no, oh, I'll only rule over this half, you take the other half. Two kings cannot wear the same crown. They both want full and absolute total control. They want the machshava dibar ma'aseh to be according to their will. Because again, a soul cannot do anything without a body. So what are you supposed to do if the body is now listening to somebody else? Well, I need it right now. I need it. What are you going to do? You're going to fight. You're going to fight over it. So you have the two souls are fighting over control of the body. They both want to be able to use the expression of the body for their purposes, toward their agenda. This is a really important point that the Alter Rebbe brings out, especially for anyone who isn't necessarily familiar with this, because what's going on here is kind of what we were talking about in the lead up to this chapter. The fact that we struggle, or the fact that we've got, one day we're so inspired, and the next day we're so not, or it can be from minute to minute even. It has nothing to do with the natural state of ourselves in the sense of like, oh, I must be such a bad person. How come I can't get it together? Well, because you're human. That's why. And the natural state of the human being is to struggle. Some people may eventually overcome the struggles, and then there's going to be new struggles before them. And then some people, their whole life is going to be a battle over the same thing. So going back to our angry persons, they may or may not ever learn to fully control their temper. It's like an addict. It always calls themselves an addict, even once they're clean. Because one thing can send them back over the edge again. Okay, we're not totally at that part yet, but here, it's sort of the same idea in the sense that the battle is always going to be going on. You know when people are like, oh, I'm late, I'm such a bad person. You know, they say things like that. I always get annoyed when people talk like that. Oh, I made a mistake, I'm so terrible. Why are you talking like that? Just because you messed up on something doesn't make you a naturally bad person. The fact that you messed up, you say, okay, so I messed up, so I made a mistake. There's a big difference between saying you're an idiot versus you've done something idiotic. There's a big difference between those two. There's a big difference between saying like, oh, you're a bad person or you've done something that you shouldn't have done. Because what we're doing now, it's not just a matter of separating the action from the person because there's consequences for action. We're allowing for that. We're not negating that. The difference is that if it's your natural state of being, then what do you want from someone? What do you want from someone if they were born with a bad temper? So you weren't born with a bad temper. You're born with a propensity toward a bad temper. And your lifelong struggle might be getting over the bad temper. Why do I always have to fight it? Because this is what you were put here for. For whatever reason, God decided this is going to be your thing. So again, some people might eventually come to a point where they learn to swallow down their anger, their natural desire, snap. I was actually just talking to someone he's dyslexic. So he said growing up, he always had a hard time, with reading or whatever. Now they have these fonts and stuff that they'll make for dyslexic people to help them to make certain letters less confusing. I actually know a writer purposely prints in that font because he wants to get to those kinds of people. He wants to get to those kinds of readers, especially younger readers, that they should have good books that are also for them, or like people do audiobooks. So he says now, okay, so eventually I kind of came over it. The dyslexia is not so bad. I could read stuff. I'm not such a fast reader, but I could read stuff. But if I'm really tired or really stressed, and it comes out again. So we might get to the point where we learn to overcome the anger or we learn to swallow it down, but maybe then when things get rough, it might bubble back up again. And you're like, didn't I get rid of this already? Didn't I get over it? No, we didn't fully get over it because we are human beings and this is part of our struggle. On the times that we listen to the godly soul, the body will do as the godly soul will, and that's great. And there are times we listen to the animal soul, and that means we're not listening to the godly soul now because, well, they're fighting. And whatever action we do is which king we're letting win right now. It's the king that we're going to let be in control at that time. It makes it easier for one side over another if you keep giving to one side over another. Keeps going with this, which we kind of did. We kind of covered this already. So, for example, the nefesh al-kes chafsa ritzona shetihi levada amosha salav manigasa v'chol var miu sam mashmata v'temat salagamri merkamela. The godly soul wants the body to be like a chariot to her. To it. It wants total control. What's the whole thing with a chariot? A chariot has no will of its own. It goes according to the will of the driver. A chariot can't drive itself. A chariot has to go according to wherever the driver leads it. That's why we talk about the Avos were like chariots. God wants, that's what I'm going to do. And not because they were sheep. They were very prominent people, very wealthy people, very highly regarded people. And still they put aside their own will for what God wants. The godly soul wants the body to be a chariot to what it wants. Like, here's what we're going to do right now. We're going to go study. We're going to go learn something. And at the same time, the animal soul is standing there with the boombox going, let's go clubbing. Let's go hang out. Let's go listen to music. And you're like, oh, which way do I go? As the godly soul is like, no. Learning is way more fun than going clubbing. It's like, sorry, I can't hear you. Volume's being turned all the way up. Anyway, whatever side we're going to listen to, that's the king that wins in the battle for control of the body. It mentions a few other things here. It talks about how the nefesh al-kes is in the brain and in the right side of the heart. It's going to try to create this love that's going to be such a great and overflowing love to the point that the love, which is kind of like a lust that's in the left side of the heart for the nefesh ha-bahamis, that we lust for things that are mundane. We call it love, we call it lust because it's not for something that's appropriate. We're not specifically talking about people, we're just talking about anything in general. What it wants to do is it wants to turn it into a love of God. We've got this emotion going on here. This is your raw material. We're now going to process it. We're not going to direct it and use it for the way that it's supposed to be used. That's where the element of water comes in. Remember we learned about all the things that come from the different elements? It's just an example that's used here. So the two souls fighting is what the Alter Rebbe says. That's why in Shema it says V'afta es Hashem Elokecha b'levavcha v'chanafshecha v'chol me'odecha. Levavcha is plural. It doesn't say b'chol libcha. It says b'chol levavcha. That's two hearts. What's the two hearts? B'shnei yitzarecha. With both of your inclinations, both of your sides. These two sides that are fighting each other are supposed to go onto the side of loving God. This is not specifically mentioned. Well, one part of it is mentioned in the chapter, but then it kind of goes on. I think it's, there's a mimer, I keep forgetting which one it is. Anyway, so it talks about different levels of pleasure, right? Because what we're trying to do, which we actually spoke about in chapter 6, the mitzvahs are according to the seichel. So a kid is going to cry over spilled milk, but an adult's going to cry over something that's way more mature than that, right? Like spilled whiskey or something. So it talks about how the nefesh al-kes is trying to get in part of the war, the battle that's going on for control of the body. The nefesh al-kes is trying to instill and get to the point where the whole body, the animal soul, is going to learn how to enjoy God. It's called the Ava B'tanugim, the love of delights. That's the highest level of just like, I love God so much. I'm delighted to be here. I love you so much. I just want to hang out with you. So it actually talks about how there's different levels of pleasure to get more refined. So you have one that we could call it like bodily pleasures or like physical pleasures. Eating good food or drinking good wine or any of that kind of stuff. Anything that satiates the body, that's the lowest level of pleasure. Then you have a level of pleasure that's a little bit more refined for that. That's a pleasure in music. People who go and they sit at the symphonies and they're sitting there for hours. That's a higher level of pleasure. It's less physical, more refined level of pleasure. That's the pleasure that comes from music. Then there's a pleasure that comes even above that, and that's an intellectual pleasure. The aha moment when things click in their brains, then they're learning something new. That's a more refined level of pleasure. So you got physical pleasures, music, intellectual, and then above all that is the Ava B'Tanugim. Above all that is just the light in the godness. All this is to say that when the godly soul, we know what the animal soul's aim is, but also say when the godly soul, when it takes control of the body, when it wants to be control of the body, it is aiming to turn all the natural state of the animal soul, turn it into holier pursuits. Turn lust into a love of God. Lust for physical, turn it into a love of God. Develop Ava and Yira. Make sure that all the limbs, the Machshava, Dibur, Maisa are all going to be for God. What's going on is a tug of war, and it's trying to pull it over. Which is what we're going to get to in the next couple of chapters. The ultimate point of success for the godly soul is if even the inclination toward not good things gets totally turned over toward an inclination toward good things. So it's not just a conquering of the city, it's bringing everybody over to your side. This is the goal of the godly soul in the fight that it's waging for control of the body. What's the problem? The animal soul wants the absolute opposite of that. It's like, boring! I want to do this holy stuff. It's boring. I don't want to do that. I want to do fun stuff. Let's go eat cake or whatever it's going to do. Why do we have the competing interests? Because first of all, this is the introduction to free will. Without the competing interests, without both sides, then we don't have real choice. If you only had a nefesh elokis, we'd just be godly beings. We'd always choose God. It's so obvious. Well, it'd be so obvious. The same way that if we could see God in the world, it would be so obvious to choose him. But without, now we actually have a choice. So because God wanted there to be a world of reward and punishment, God wanted there to be a world of free choice, he created the competing interests. And our goal is overcoming the other side and turning it all to godly purposes. Even though the animal soul wants these things and it wants the opposite of what the godly soul wants, ultimately, deep down inside, it wants it for the good of the person. It wants to actually be conquered. For example, we have the mashal of the zona that comes from the Zohar. It just shows you how practical Tanya is, that it just gives us this kind of the lush. What's the mashal of the zona? Talk about the harlot, the prostitute, whatever we're going to call her. So it says there was once a king and he wanted to test the moral fortitude of his son, the crown prince. You're coming next up in line. I want to make sure you're qualified. We want to make sure you're up for this. He goes out and he finds a prostitute. And he's like, listen, I'm going to hire you to try to seduce my son. We're going to see what kind of person he really is. So on the one hand, prostitute, she's got a job to do. She's got to try to seduce the crown prince. And she can't turn in half a job. She's got to do a full job. This is what she's been hired to do. This is what her job is. At the same time, deep down inside, she wants to fail. She wants the crown prince to actually not give in to her because she wants future king to be someone of actual moral fortitude. And to not just be someone who is so easily swayed. So this is the example they give of the nefesh Bahamas. Of the animal soul is like that. God created it to be this pulling inclination. It created it to be a warring king. But deep down, even though it's from Klipa and even though everything has come from deep down, it really wants us to resist it. But it's going to put up a fight. It was hired for something and it's going to do a very good job in trying to fulfill its mission. But at least maybe if the imagery can help, the next time you're faced with a temptation or something like that, imagine in your mind, well, it's just a prostitute trying to seduce me. I will not give in to your wild. Very good imagery for trying to not give in to sin and temptation and desire. Get out the clubbing imagery. That's too much fun. Anyways, that's chapter 9. The general idea of that, the two souls are fighting for control of the body. And the next couple of chapters are going to be, so what happens when the godly soul totally wins? What happens when the animal soul totally wins? What's in between that? That's the actual Beinoni. Trying to learn about the Beinoni comes to chapter 12. Again, part of what's so important about this is that realizing that there's the battle that's going on. You know that ultimately the outcome is supposed to be our success and totally fighting it. But there's no timeline for this. There's no like, oh, if you engage in the battle, you will win tomorrow and then everything will be fine. There's no promise of that. Except for the beginning that there's nothing easy about the path that's before us. All it is explanation about the reason why some days you're so on it and Judaism, woohoo, and some days you're like, why are we here? Is because the battle's going on. And then you can realize that on the days when you're like, what is this? Who's talking? Who are we listening to? And the days that we don't necessarily come through and we feel so bad that yesterday I was on such a spiritual high and today I'm not. 5 minutes ago I was on a spiritual high. Today I'm not. Or while I'm in the Tanya class I'm on such a spiritual high. Then after I just go about my daily life and don't feel it anymore, it's not because we're evil, terrible, sinful people. It's not because we're inadequate or anything like that. It's because we're humans and we have this fight that's going on inside of us. And our struggle is to try to make sure the right side wins. Try to listen to the right side. Unfortunately, it's not a battle that's ever fully won. You might win one stage and move on to the next stage, but the battle's going to be constant within us. And understanding that is just very important for our whole approach to things. and to know what our expectations for ourselves are supposed to be. The expectation is to engage in the battle and to try to make sure the right side wins, but to also realize that there's not going to be an absolute victory, because that denies the human condition, that we're made to have this struggle, because that is where free choice and all that kind of stuff comes from.